All right, Jay, what's going on, man?
What up, dude? Excited to
Glad
be here today.
glad to have you on the show. I feel like I haven't talked to you since this morning and yesterday and the day before when we texted
I
all the
know we are codependent.
time. Welcome to No Agenda. This is your host, David Sherry. No Agenda is a web show. We are live right now on Twitch. This also gets posted as a podcast. And the premise of the show is that we surf the web with our favorite online project creators, business starters, podcasters like Jay, and we get into the real nitty gritty of what it actually looks like to create these projects. And for me, I've always been really curious. You see these web projects and they blow your mind and they feel like magic, but like, what does it actually look like to organize, execute, design, build these different businesses or projects? So that's what this show is about. Jay is going to introduce himself here in a second, but he is does a lot of different things. He actually hosts groups of entrepreneurs in his company Unreal Collective in sort of a mastermind type format. But he also has a podcast called Upside, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Today, the show is about how do you build a podcast from scratch. We're going to dive into the tools. We're going to dive into the process, how he reaches out to guests, and all of that is going to be pulled up on screen. And Jay has it all waiting for you on screen. So with that, Jay, I know you've got like a deck here, but why don't you tell me a little bit just about like the premise of Upside?
Yeah, totally. So, Upside as a show, we say it's the first podcast dedicated to startups outside of Silicon Valley. So, Eric and I, we're both big podcast fans and frequent listeners of a lot of shows. Both of us independently had been talking about wanting to do a show, or at least thinking about wanting to do a show. And neither of us wanted to do sort of your standard interview show because it seemed like there were a lot of those. And if you're going to compete on the I bring in amazing guests who can help you be amazing too front, you're fighting kind of a losing battle unless you have the access of people like Tim Ferriss and Lewis Howes. And so Upside was an effort to take our desire to learn more about angel investing and put it into the format of a podcast. So you see how that's hitting lots of birds with one stone. We're scratching our own itch of learning a process. We're putting a show out into the world, and we're also having a really great excuse to meet awesome people that we would want to talk to generally otherwise. So I'll talk about the process a little bit more.
It's a good reason to have good reason to have a show, right? I mean, I think that's
100%.
the benefits of building is there are people that you want to meet.
100%. And we've only had, I think, 2 people who have declined to be on the show that we've asked. And they were both due to timing or health reasons. Like anybody we've asked, and we're shooting kind of high in some of these cases, they've just been totally up for it or down for it, whatever direction it is that you are in agreement for doing something.
And we might get to this later, and this is no agenda, so we can take rabbit holes if we need to. But I feel like there's like this ladder process that is inherent in a podcast or an interview show or something like that, where you say to yourself, if I can get this guest, I can get that guest. If I can get, X person, that means I can get, and you can kind of like build your way towards the ideal guest in your head. And so since this show is sort of about like, how did you start? How did you think about this project? Do you have like an ideal guest, or like, is there somewhere you're reaching towards, or is that not necessarily the case for this?
Yeah, definitely. And I think just for context, I'll lay out the format of the show just so it's clear how it flows. It's about 90 minutes, which is on the long side. And there are 3 specific segments in each show, or at least in the standard shows. And it mirrors the process that an angel investor would go through when considering an investment in an early stage, usually high growth technology company. The first is research. Investors will do independent research on a company they're going to talk to and vet to understand the market, competitors, trends in the market, anything they can find out about the team and any traction they've gotten so far. The second phase is interviewing, talking with the founder and learning more about the business from the founder themselves. And then the third phase is writing what is called a deal memo, which is can be formal if you have limited partners, people who have invested into your firm. It can be a formal piece of documentation that you send to the people who have invested their money into you to say, hey, I met with this company. Here's what I learned about them. Here's what I thought. Here's why I would invest, or here's why I would not invest. And so we took that structure and built it into our podcast, where the first 5 to 10 minutes are Eric and I talking about our independent research. The next 60-ish minutes is an interview with the founder, pretty much unedited. And then the last 20 minutes is Eric and I, after we talk to the guests, talking just the two of us again, going through what we liked about the company, reasons why we might invest, things that might give us pause if we were considering it as an opportunity. And so our ideal guests are founders of companies. And specifically, we're looking at the early stages of a company, preferably before Series A. So we're really looking at where angel investors would sit pre-Series A. Companies that have some traction and honestly look pretty good for a Series A is the ideal guest that we have.
Love it. So the inspiration and the insight to start a podcast was two things. One, you felt like the podcast is about startups outside Silicon Valley, so you saw this trend, like, hey, there's this thing happening, not enough people are paying attention to it. Maybe that's something interesting we could talk about. The second thing is seeing for yourself, there's this process that I'm trying to learn. And if I create a project that allows me to practice this process in public,
right?
Like this forcing mechanism to record these shows, to talk to these people, to go through that 3-stage process you outlined. Wouldn't that be cool? And I love hearing that, because I feel like, and we'll get into the success of the show and stuff like that later, but I love hearing that, because to me that says, that's like the ideal way I feel like for a business or a project to start, is like, here's the thing I want to learn. The business is going to force me to doing that. Here's a trend I'm seeing that I think no one else is paying attention to. And like all of the things, when they come together, I think can produce something really powerful. And it's cool to see that.
And you and I have talked about this before. The other great thing about that approach is that from day one, you're set up for success. Because I'm not doing this show because I need 1 million people to download every episode. I'm doing this because I'm trying to learn a process and to understand and get better myself. And I accomplish that by just doing it, whether I have 1 million listeners or 10 listeners,
Yep. Yeah. It's like Jeff Bezos day. It's always day one. So I know you probably have more to say about the show itself and the format and stuff like that, but I kind of want to get into actually maybe like how it came together.
Totally.
So like, let's talk about, okay, you've got this idea, you see how, okay, it's a win for myself no matter what, because I'm going to learn this process, even if not that many people listen, still great. Now that you actually commit and say, I'm going to make this thing, where do you start?
Totally. So, and actually I can run through this. There's a couple slides here.
Sure. Yeah. Skip right ahead.
So it started because in September of 2017, I was starting to get phone calls from investors in the Valley who were saying, hey, we're coming to Ohio in the spring. Can you set us up with some meetings for companies there so that we can meet with them? And I was just like, that's super interesting. I'm going to do that because they're friends of mine. But also, shouldn't I be like getting some sort of like, I feel like I was just this middleman in the process who was realizing no upside for myself. I had just been recognized as somebody who could help them out, and I was going to help my friends out because that's great for me. But it seemed like there was some other opportunity there present that I was not actually capturing. And so I was wondering, what should I be doing to capture that? And so I was talking to a friend of mine, Alex Frohmeyer, this beautiful bald man on the screen. And he's a founder of a company called Beam Dental in Columbus. They just raised a Series C from Kleiner Perkins. They're based in Columbus, Ohio, and Kleiner never invests outside of the Valley. So he's doing really great things. And I was telling him about this situation, these investors calling me, and he was like, yo, dude, that's called a scout. That's something that exists already on the West Coast. And I didn't know what that was. So he explained to me, he says, okay, the guys that you probably know, Chris Sacca and Jason Kalkanis, those guys were two of the original scouts. And actually their title was called Entrepreneur in Action. It was EIA. And what had happened was when things started to get more competitive on the coast for early stage investment opportunities, the big firms like Kleiner, like Greylock, like Sequoia said, how do we increase our competitive advantage and still get deal flow to the best companies? And so Sequoia kind of innovated in this place where they said, what if we found people who were really well connected to the early stage companies, and they could be our pipeline when those companies hit some level of traction and they were looking for institutional capital, they would send them to Sequoia. And so they started the scout program where they gave guys like Chris Sacca and Jason Kalkanis hundreds of thousands of dollars, I think even millions of dollars in some cases, and said, write these checks to anyone you want, whatever size you want. You keep the carry. We don't expect any of this back. But when they're ready for institutional funding, send them to Sequoia. So both these guys, two of the most successful angel portfolios on the planet, and they build it on someone else's money, which is crazy. I was like, that sounds pretty good. I would love to do that. But I didn't really understand how I would ever accomplish that because I didn't know anything about investing. It's a completely different world to me. I understood the startup space, and I had a ton of great relationships here in Columbus and Ohio broadly, and even starting to be the Midwest. And so I called my buddy Eric, who knew the investment side of things because he works in New York City at an investment bank. And I met him in college because he was in finance. He just knows money. I told him, this is a fun picture that I like to show. This is Eric and I in college. He's dead center with great hair. I'm to the left when I had my bald phase in college.
So you pair up, you remember this friend from college, and you give him, after thinking through this pattern matching you sort of did about Jason Kalkanis and other investors, and you pattern match that, and that's when you think, I got to call friend from college who's in finance. Right.
And Eric and I had gotten along because we did these consulting projects and these consulting competitions together. And he was always like the hardcore analytical forecasting spreadsheets guy. And I always came in and I was just like, oh, I have like good ideas for the solution to this problem. Can you guys reason your way into making that seem financially viable? Funny story about one of those case competitions. Giant Eagle, which is a restaurant or a grocery chain here in Ohio, and I think in places like Pittsburgh, they sponsored one of our case competitions, and our team won that competition. They were looking for ways to attract the younger demographic to shop there, and we convinced them that it was useful for them to make make your own 6-pack section of Giant Eagle, and that exists now from that case competition.
I've seen that. I think I've purchased from that.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
That's amazing. So that was Eric and I.
Incredible innovation. So you call up Eric. Tell him right away. This do, or do you play it more cool like that? Because I'm kind of curious about the way that what we're talking about now is the way that collaborators come together, because Eric is the second half of the show. So your partner in crime there. So do you come in hot, or how do you get Eric to join you on this journey of starting a podcast?
I came in real hot, and I was just like, hey dude, I want to learn about investing. I'm getting calls from VCs on the West Coast, and I think there's something to be gained here, like as a scout fund or making our own scout program, just having like a micro fund. I think that could work. And he was just like, hey, I got this book for you. And he sent me a book by Jason Kalkanis called Angel, which is where we pulled the format that I described from. There was a chapter that talked about his process as an angel investor, the steps he walked through, and it was research, talk to the founder, write a deal memo. Because even though that deal memo is written to nobody in particular, it serves as this like calibrating mechanism for you sometime in the future. So I came in real hot, and I was just like, I want to learn about this. I think there's an opportunity here. And there's a slide here. I don't know where it was. Where I was just like, we're just gonna kill this. I was just like, yeah, I think that we could consider some sort of like fund or something. And he said, I have a half-finished PowerPoint with the same idea. And like,
wow, okay, so he had like literally already been thinking about the same thing that you were, and so it's like one of those weird scenarios where like it just is.
And it wasn't even just thinking about he wanted to start like a micro VC fund. it was specifically he wanted to start a micro VC fund with me because I had the relationships and he understood investing, which was
Crazy.
crazy.
So you had complementary skill sets, and I do want to get into maybe anything that you guys had to learn about working together along the way. So you call Eric. He's like, dude, I'm thinking about the same thing. We have complementary skill sets. We've worked together before because we had a relationship in college, and we made that thing for Giant Eagle, which is now should have been paid for, but never got paid for. And then how do you go from that to recording the first show? I mean, does the idea die for a little bit? Does it stay really excited? Do you say, if we don't start this next week, this will never happen? Like, get me to recording the first
I think
episode.
we started putting together like a deck, which is hilarious. And we were calling it for a little bit. We were calling it Product Cheddar.
Terrible. I'm glad.
Project Cheddar.
Project Cheddar.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm not going to go through all this deck because I don't even remember what's inside of it. But
we'll scroll a little. Well, I don't know if you can, but sure.
This might be the only slide. It's not.
For those listening on the podcast, we were reviewing the original logo of Upside Podcast, which was originally called Project Cheddar.
Even put like and he started this deck. He even put this little slice of cheese at the bottom. So
okay, so you want to organize your ideas. So you find your co-founder, quote unquote, and then someone's got to organize what the heck this thing's going to be.
And remember, he works at a financial advisory, not an investment bank. For him, he is just all the experience in the world writing like pitch books and PowerPoints and spreadsheets. Like that's his world, and so he was just like, here's like some of the PowerPoint. And so at this point, this was still November-ish of 2017, and we were still thinking about a fund specifically. I remember, David, you were visiting in my apartment, and I was talking through like my major rocks, my large goals of 2018, and I'd had on that list Project Cheddar as something that like I wanted to make some time for. But we just didn't think there was any way we would be ready to make any major moves in that direction until mid to late 2018.
Why?
Because he was in the process of studying for his CFA exam. He wanted to get his CFA. He was still like comfortable and happy with his job. And I don't want to speak too much for him and his like realities.
What's so hard about trying to record something? Or did you feel like you had to commit if you were really going to do it?
We didn't have the idea for the format or even the concept of a podcast until December.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it takes time for these ideas to sort of actually germinate. Like it's not, maybe people sometimes think that it's like you have this idea and then all of a sudden you get started on it. It's more like you started thinking about it this way, and then some other things came into the world and said that this might be possible. And then you found someone who has a similar passion, and both of you were interested, but then other things still had to kind of like grow from there.
Yeah. He had sent me the book Angel to read through, to think about angel investing specifically, like if I wanted to be an angel investor, and he had read through it already. And so I spent some time reading through that, and it was just like, well, this is a big idea for us to just like drop everything and raise a fund would be kind of crazy. When are we going to do that? And for him, it was like timeline stuff. I had some timeline stuff. I was still, I'm a glorified freelancer. And so I still have to like make money to survive. And in December, he texted me out of the blue. I remember I was at the Idea Foundry. I think you might have been there actually. Is before heading home for Christmas break. And it was like just about to snow a bunch. And I had to record like an intro video for LinkedIn, like an audition tape for LinkedIn Learning. And he had texted me that morning at the same time and was like, hey, why would it be a bad idea to do a podcast? And so we were just like firing texts off, talking through like why this wouldn't work or why it would. And then we started talking about the specific format. And then I remember sitting down and searching through and seeing like, this has to exist. There has to be a podcast that walks through, as opposed to just your typical Shark Tank, tell us your numbers, let us talk about whether you're a good opportunity or not. The full like spectrum of, research to interview to writing the specifics about why or why not. And we just couldn't find it. So we said, okay, this is a really good low risk start to this.
Some market research, and nothing's out there, and what's the harm in trying? So I want to get to the recording of the first show and how you knew what to use. Like, yeah, where did you buy a microphone? Did you call each other on Skype and just record it? Like, get me to the first. I know there's a bit on organization you need to catch me up to speed on, but like,
I think we
that first episode.
I think we recorded the first episode in January or February. I could actually look up that specific date, but I think it was in January. And I had gotten a microphone for Christmas from my parents because I thought I was going to do my own interview show under Unreal. So I had a microphone, but we had to think intentionally about a guest. It took us a while to think about that format. We actually spent time dealing with more infrastructure things like the album art and the intro music and like the intro words. And then we had like,
let's talk through that. Do you have anything you can show me related to intro music or anything of that nature?
Yeah, I'm trying to find if we had a deck that was literally the flow of, yeah. This is before we record anything. Another classic Eric deck here, where he's like, here's what I'm thinking. And he loves things like alliteration and
I see that.
The
undulation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he had this 3-step flow for the show that he put together. Looks like I made an edit on that in April, but I think this was first created in like February. And so he was like, here's what I'm thinking. We have these 3 segments. We call it the upfront. We call it the undulation, which we've totally dropped since that time. Yeah, look at these flowcharts. This is amazing. Everything we did was probably like way too planned.
Okay, you guys really put in that's why I'm trying to get us to the first episode. But I see now that there's a lot of organization happening.
Yeah,
and really it's refining. And like you said, you dropped this already, so continue.
Yeah. And so we recorded the first episode, and I remember I had like this flow up on my computer screen as we're doing it because we're like, okay, this is what we want to talk about in the interview. And we're trying to map these 4 questions that were also in Angel, which is like his core questions for whether or not he would invest in a company. How committed is this founder? What are this founder's chances of success in life and in this business? Why has the founder chosen this business? What does winning look like in terms of revenue and my return? So we literally mapped out, like, as we go through the interview, we want to start with the founder's story, and that's going to talk to us about how committed is this founder? What are their chances of success? Why have they chosen this business? Also, then get into their company story, and then get into like the numbers and the opportunity late in the interview. And so we like had this all mapped out as to how we were going to get out of a 60-minute interview all the information we would want to make an informed decision about whether we would invest in these companies. And we spent 0 time thinking about how Eric and I would like operate on the mics. And so
sure, because our first it's a guest plus 2 people who are organizing.
Yeah.
So who's doing what? So yeah, who's the first guest and how did that first show go?
And it was actually a little bit, we shortcutted things a little bit because you and I had worked on the first 4 years back in like May of 2017.
Yep.
Which was actually like my first like freelance gig was helping you with that show.
So rewind
and so
fast for context. I hired Jay to help me start my podcast. And I think my pitch to you, but maybe I'm making this up, was, hey, you're probably going to do a podcast at some point. You should help me start mine so that you know how to do one later. I think that's what happened.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that's what happened. And worked through a lot of like the production and process side of things. I didn't actually do a lot of the tooling. I left like most of the publishing and tooling stuff and editing stuff to you. So that was where I learned the most. But I think I just asked you, I was like, how do you record your interviews? And you said Ecamm.
Yeah.
So we started using that from like day one.
So this is maybe a backwards question here. What are the elements of a podcast? Like, let's just say we're starting from scratch. It's like, you've got, give me, if you can think off the top of your head, what is the overview of the elements that are necessary to put in place to record a good podcast?
You have your album art, which has nothing to do with recording, but if you're going to make a show, you have to be serious about your album art. You're going to have some sort of intro theme that is just like this regular thing that people can get used to, and it kind of just puts your mind into like this phasing into this show type of mood. So that can be music, that can be some of the recording of you saying something. Usually it's a little bit of both. Then you have whatever the content is for that show, followed by a common sort of outro theme, usually also has music and some words. Once you have all the actual raw audio elements, you have to upload and host that somewhere so that people can actually hear it widely. That generally creates an RSS feed that will syndicate to all the other podcast players out there, which like is very functional, not at all intuitive, and probably one of the scarier things for people at first. Because I remember thinking about this, like, how do I get my show on all of these different platforms that exist? And it mostly does it on its own, is the short answer. If you work with a good hosting service,
pull something up that's related to those tools. I think it's a great breakdown. So you've got, you want to think about your show broken up from the intro to the sort of meat of the podcast to the outro. You've got obviously just like the content and the flow. Then there's the functional elements, where you're going to record with your guests, what type of guests do you want, where you're going to host the podcast so that it can be sent out across different networks. And there's iTunes, there's Stitcher, there's there's so many now. I'd be curious, maybe in a little bit, if there's a specific like network that you're syndicating to that is more popular and like other people should be thinking about if they're going to start a podcast. And did you do this all yourself? Was there a website you checked out that helped you understand podcasting? How did you, just Googling around?
Basically, my rule of thumb when I'm trying to answer any question for the first time is I think, who has already solved this problem? And then I go ask them. So the first guy I went to is this guy named Kwame, who incidentally is also the guy who really spurred the idea of Unreal Collective. But he has a podcast that's super popular globally called like Negotiate Anything. It's a podcast about negotiation. And I was like, where should I host? And he was like, no questions asked, host on Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout is great. They have great support. You can use Libsyn or Blueberry, but definitely use Buzzsprout. And so our first 3 episodes we hosted on Buzzsprout, and Buzzsprout was good. Like it was better in my opinion than Libsyn and Podbean, but it was pretty expensive for the amount of raw like data that I was uploading on a monthly basis. I was paying something like $24 a month for their highest tier plan, which isn't crazy, but it was $24 a month, and other stuff was like 10. Then as I got closer to the time of launching the show, I was really taking seriously building a website for the show. And I was looking around at other people's websites. And one, I think maybe you sent it to me, David. I'm not sure who did. One was called The Gently Mad. And I've actually never listened to the show. But his guests are people that I respect. And I really like the design of the show. And when I looked at his episodes, there aren't a ton of hosting services and web players out there. And this really stood out. I was like, this looks beautiful. Like this is just a good looking player. And so I thought, I want that. Where's that? And it said Transistor. So I clicked Transistor. And at the time it was in beta. And I thought, well, who are these guys?
Shout out.
And so I found out. Yeah. Shout out to Justin Jackson. Found out it was Justin Jackson. And so I think I just sent them a message in there, like, intercom or whatever their chat widget was. And I was like, hey, could I get access? And they said, sure. And the great thing about Transistor giving me beta access is I got beta pricing, which was less than Buzzsprout. And I think it's a superior service. And I think I just get grandfathered at that price point forever.
Wait,
because it would actually be more expensive.
Just retell me again, what does Transistor do for you?
Transistor is my hosting service.
And what does that mean?
It is where the files actually get uploaded and stored. It creates an RSS feed, and that RSS feed is what gets syndicated to all the players.
Cool.
So without Transistor, it would not be available to listen to on any of the podcast players that you're familiar with.
So that's how it shows up on your phone in the app and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So is there any other tool that you've been using that, and this could even be some of like the organization of the podcast and stuff like that too, but is there any other tool that you've been using that's been sort of critical to either launching or growing the podcast?
Yes. First, I would say Twitter. And second, I would say our website. But definitely Twitter. But like long before we even had anything out, we created a Twitter account and we were active in a couple of ways. We were starting to follow and engage with people who were in the space that we thought would be good guests as companies or people who were just in the space, other investors or community builders outside of Silicon Valley. And so something that's kind of a big tenet of mine personally is if there are people that you want to meet or get introduced to or have pay attention to you, you just need to stay in their line of sight in a non-annoying or non-invasive way. And Twitter is like perfect for that. You can just engage with their tweets, like their tweets, comment on things without bombarding them with emails and saying like, hey, can I pick your brain? Or hey, can I talk with you? It's much more of a passive way to just get somebody's attention over a period of time.
So
Twitter
want to just directly ask for someone to be on the show. You wanted to like maybe at least have them say your name, like see your name before or something like that.
Yeah, and it was good because in small ways it validated what we were doing. We would have people follow us just based on, our Twitter bio. We didn't have anything live. There's nothing for them to see. But if somebody follows you or likes your tweet, they're going to click your account name and they're going to do a real quick eye test to see, is this interesting and relevant to me? If so, I'm going to follow it. And so we could tell in real time by how people are engaging with us if our message was landing for the people that we were going to want to like have it land with.
Speaking of eye test, do you think that there is something that people should be thinking about when it comes to the cover art? Because it is interesting. Like, let's talk about like actually seeing your podcast on iTunes. There's the introduction text. There's reviews of the show. There's the album art, and that's like pretty much it. That's all you have to go off of, aside from it being sort of picked up in lists and stuff like that. Anything that you would say about the reviews, intro, or album art?
I think that ratings are important as just a heuristic people look at as to how popular the show is, even though it can be total bullshit. You can have a show that's really popular and well listened to that has 10 ratings. You could also have a show that's barely listened to at all with hundreds of ratings.
Why is that?
Because as a podcast producer and host, I will push people to leave a rating on the show very manually, 1-to-1. If someone reaches out and they said, hey, listen to this episode, it was great, I will say, that's amazing. Thank you so much. Will you leave a rating?
It's a great point.
And
I don't know.
Over that,
I haven't responded to people and said that myself.
And over time, like you just slowly, one by one, build that up. And, a lot of legitimacy is the perception of legitimacy. Like, and sometimes you can manufacture that at the beginning and it really helps.
So I was gonna say, let's jump to some episodes are rolling now. So you've done your first episode about that there. Did anything go wrong? Like, did fires sort of happen? But let's kind of get into now this podcast is starting to maybe build a little bit of steam.
Yeah, totally. So, well, early on, something I want to touch on the album art real quick because I do think it's important.
Yep.
You want to have something that is attention grabbing and fairly simple. You don't really want text. We have text on ours, and I'll probably take it off soon. It's just like almost never readable in the different sizes of thumbnails that you get. But you want it to be eye-catching, and that usually comes with either high contrast or bright colors, clean typefaces. It should just be simple. Something that probably plays against us that I didn't realize until we had published the show is that in the podcast player, usually your shows are ranked alphabetically or shown alphabetically, and we are sitting with a U. Like, we are down at the bottom all the time. I don't think it's a surprise that Seth Godin called his show Akimbo.
Fascinating. I almost think you should have called it unupside or something like that. Another upside.
And upside. Or like underscore upside.
yeah, right. One upside, like the number one.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So when we got started, something else that we took really seriously, because the show's about companies outside of Silicon Valley. It's kind of like an underdog thing. We wanted the album art to be done by someone who fits that description. And so a graphic designer at a startup here in Columbus made the thumbnail for me based on the direction the sole direction of, I said, I like Song Exploders album art.
You can bring that up if you want.
I was just like, I like the brightness, the contrast. I like how simple it is. And
well, it's funny. It makes me think. There's like this is actually a Seth Godin line that I thought was brilliant, which is, the purpose of a book cover is to remind you of a book that you've read before and liked. And so he said every new book cover should be a reference from a previous book cover that you think your target demographic has already listened to. So I don't know. It just made me think about that a little bit with just sharing sort of, you want it to be reminiscent of maybe another podcast that people like.
Yeah. So this was pretty much the sole direction for our album art, which looks like this, which you can kind of see in just the like block nature. This is a version 2 of the album art because the original didn't have as high of contrast. The gray outside of the United States borders was too dark, so you couldn't even see most of the time that there was a country border there. Yeah. Whoops, is that still highlighted?
So
what
now,
are we talking about?
Now I want to get to I want to get to 2 areas next. Tell me about things that went wrong, and tell me about things that felt like you were gaining momentum. And you can start with either of those.
So something that went wrong early on is we were looking for intro music, and we are getting close on time. We were looking for intro music, and I thought I had the perfect guy, this local rapper who does awesome stuff. He did a commercial for Melvin Gordon for EAS Myoplex. And at the time, HQ Trivia was like really popular. And so the one thing I knew about HQ that I really liked is when it started counting down to playing, it was like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then there was this whoop. And I love that. I was like, I want people when they start listening to the podcast, I want them to feel hype, and I want that like woo. And this guy was going to deliver on that. He emailed us like weeks later and just said, "Hey, actually can't help." And so we were just behind. So I was looking around, and there was another rapper in town who co-founded an app that we featured on the podcast called Rap Chat. And I was like, "Hey man, can I like borrow and license one of your songs for our show?" And he was like, "Yeah, I've got tons and tons of files. Just tell me what you want." And so I gave him that like whoop description, and he sent me one that just wasn't positive enough. It was just like kind of low energy. And I was like, "No, this is too heavy. I need something else." And he's like, yeah, I'll give it to you. And I just got impatient and started surfing his SoundCloud. And we were looking around, and I just went through his like catalog of songs that he had on here, went through each of these until I got down to this album called About Time. And I started listening to this track About Time and loved it, because actually, I don't know if music playing through, if I play this music, do you think it'll come through?
Try it out.
Do you hear that?
I'm not sure if it's going to be picked up or not.
I don't think, I don't think it's coming through. I can share a link because it became our intro music. But you see that here in like the waves, when it quiets down, like before the spike. Oops, I should be pointing here. Right before this spike.
No, I'm back.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's going to come through, but you can imagine it.
Yeah, I don't think it is. Right before this spike, like everything quiets down and it goes whoop, and then it
so
becomes like a banger.
Track. Well, I love the idea that you, like, when you're thinking about who should you hire for this show, your immediate thought was, let's make this true to what we're about, which is the album art. I want someone from the Midwest to do it. The music, I want someone from the Midwest to do it who happens to also have a company that we could maybe interview for the show. So I think that was like really smart. And it just helps with like the authenticity as well. So I know that, time's short for you today. Jay is traveling right now. And so he doesn't have as much time. And so maybe we'll have to do a part 2, and we can get to the show really starting to blow up. Maybe some of the metrics in a part 2.
I might be able to I can just send an email here because one, I don't have the call-in information that I need, and two, it was
This
kind of
is
a
why
late
this is
minute
no
ad.
agenda, because we are on the fly adjusting our schedule. And for those of you listening on the podcast, once again, we are bringing up a lot of the things that are being referenced on the screen over video. So you can find that on YouTube at No Agenda on YouTube. And we also stream the show on Twitch. So you can go to No Agenda TV on Twitch and listen to the show live, ask questions while I'm here with the guest. And we can kind of incorporate your feedback into the show as well, which would be really fun. Jay, I'm loving this conversation. So if you've got time, let's just keep going. So
let's just keep going.
Your intro music came from a local rapper who also has a company related to rap. And that was inspired by HQ Trivia because of the whoop sound they made in the game. Love it. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Actually, I'm going to try one more thing. I'm going to pull my headphones out. I'm going to play.
Yeah, there's a way for me to do it, but it's too complex. So just blast it.
All right, let's start this over. Go back. Okay.
If it doesn't come through, you can listen to the show upside down. But let's see. Yeah, I think that's gonna work. Go ahead.
I think this is gonna work. You ready?
Sounds great. Love it.
Yeah, so that's what we heard. And I literally just told Eric, I was like, hey, I think I found the song. And then I was like, actually in the same room that I'm calling you from right now, in my parents' basement for Thanksgiving, or maybe it was Christmas, when I first like recorded this. And I heard that song, I'm like, this is great. And so I pressed play. I had my laptop volume up as high as I could. And then with my phone close to my mouth, I recorded a voice memo of me talking an intro line or two while the music was playing. I'm like, I think this is what our intro is going to be. And like literally verbatim, that's been our intro. We cleaned it up and recorded it into like a real microphone, but it was exactly that, like first swipe.
I love that for the sort of hack version of putting together your intro, because it just shows you didn't have to spend that much time to get something that was good enough to be posted. The other thing that's interesting is I think almost anybody could probably go on SoundCloud just generally without even knowing the people. And I bet a lot of the artists would be honored to have their music featured on your show. So if you're somebody who's thinking about starting a podcast and you're like, well, you know, how am I going to get music for this? If that's like the holdup, maybe just go to SoundCloud and surf around and find something that you love that's inspired and reach out to them.
Yeah, I guarantee Pat, and his moniker is P Hala. I guarantee Pat had no idea that we would still be going this many months after I contacted him. He was probably like, yeah, sure, dude, do whatever you want. And so I think it's pretty cool for him now to see that that's getting some play, because, you know, most of the time he's in the day-to-day of like running marketing for a startup. And so like this is just another way to get his music out there.
Yeah, totally. And maybe he'll meet an investor in some way through that connection or something like that. So you've got the music, you're recording away, the episodes are starting to roll. I had asked a question and we went down the rabbit hole, which is perfectly fine. But the question is really two questions. First, what broke, what, you know, got blown up or whatever, what didn't work? And then also, when did you have a moment that it felt like this show is really taking off? Maybe start with the fire.
Yeah. So we spun out for a little bit, and David, you and I did this too when we were doing No Agenda, or sorry, first 4 years at the time, where we were really concerned and hinging everything we were doing around this idea of the new and noteworthy section on iTunes, which from what I can tell now is an absolute myth. It was once a thing that was once impactful, but is now no longer completely like it just does. It's not even something that
explain
Apple
that real
anymore.
quick. So there's a list on Apple's iTunes that put you in the new show category, and that drove a lot of traffic for you.
So for folks who aren't familiar with the podcasting space, Apple has kind of found itself in the center of the podcasting universe, and totally by accident. Like they created this functionality, and it that became podcasting as a way to sell more iPhones. And they did not realize that podcasting was going to become a thing. And once it became a thing, Apple was the best of a bunch of horrible tools out there for making it work. And so now they find themselves still at the center of the podcasting universe and woefully unprepared to do things. But back in the day, when podcasts were first getting started, and there weren't many of them, they did create a section of their iTunes store for new and noteworthy podcasts. And when there weren't many podcasts out, this section was a big deal, and it was really impactful for shows that got featured in that section. And the common belief, which really didn't have any documented proof behind it, just a lot of anecdotal stories. The common belief was that you had 8 weeks from the launch of your show on iTunes to be considered new and be able to be put in the new and noteworthy section. And podcasters who hit that section in early days of podcasting, that could make their podcast, because suddenly it was in front of people who were like, I love this new medium. I want to follow some shows that are good. And so people are still perpetuating this belief that new and noteworthy is a big, impactful thing. And there is still a new and noteworthy section on the app. It's just very rarely updated. I don't think it has any real timeline on it. And it also doesn't have any real measurable effect, because that's not where discovery of podcasts happens anymore. So we spent so much time like thinking through this 8-week strategy, and David, you and I did the same, and it just didn't matter.
Fascinating.
Because it wasn't a thing. The better thing that we did for our launch was Twitter and spinning up a web page before we had launched anything with an email sign up. So that was cool. We ended up recording 2 interviews, one of which we knew was going to be practice. The second we thought might not be practice, but turned into practice because they'll never see the light of day.
What went wrong?
Because well, it's the first time that, one, we had run through the format. Eric and I hadn't tested our own like rapport on the microphones before with a guest. You have your standard like audio issues. I hadn't calibrated my eCam to be the right settings yet, or my microphone. We didn't know what to advise the guests to do with their equipment. And so just like overall wasn't great. We were really timid. We didn't ask the questions we needed to ask. The guests that we brought on weren't like the right. And this was intentional. We didn't bring on guests who we thought would be like the right guests. We brought on earlier stage guests. And so that was actually more difficult to do the interviews because there's less substance to talk about. But so I would say that those things were like messy, but I wouldn't say they were like fires, because it was planned messy to get better.
A few episodes in, you're recording the show. Do you feel confident and excited to continue, or do you feel like this is going downhill, or this is not going to go anywhere, or like, what are we actually doing here? Was there a moment of the depths of sorrow?
Not quite, maybe like a month ago, but early on, a couple things that were
fun because so we'll get to this in a little bit, but their show has been doing very well within the past few weeks. We'll be showing some metrics and stuff like that here in a little bit, but I love that was a month ago that there was a depth of sorrow right before.
Yeah. Well, and Eric and I went into this, and having been writing consistently like every day for close to a year and a half, I told him from day one, I said, we're going to have to be completely consistent, and we're going to yell into the void for like 2 years. And so I made sure that we had that expectation painted at the beginning. And so we weren't afraid of that as much. And it was clear from the beginning that our format was unique, in that it wasn't just an interview show. That 3-segment format was really good for people who were at the intersection of interests of entrepreneurship and investing. The hard thing is that's a very niche person. That's a hard person to find. And the number one piece of feedback we get is your show's too long. And that always comes from people who aren't in that niche. In fact, it comes from people who haven't even listened to the show. So the length of the show is more of a barrier for people to click play and listen to it than a barrier for people to get through it.
Fascinating.
The people who enjoy it will say, I don't care how long it is.
So you're getting feedback, and I'm going to ask you how specifically you're getting feedback. When the show is underway, you're getting listeners. you're feeling pretty comfortable with things. You start getting feedback, and you get two different bits of feedback. One group that's saying that they're really enjoying the show from the sound of it.
Mm-hmm.
The other group, which is saying, it's too long for me. I can't listen. And how do you parse that? And how did you?
Well, we collected a ton of feedback, and I'll actually share this screen with you too, if this loads. Mm-hmm. Let's see how far back I can go.
And are you sharing a Google spreadsheet or something?
Nope. I'm going to show you our Slack channel. Eric and I communicate over Slack because at the beginning, he and I, we just communicated over text message, which was like impossible to sort and refer back to later. And so it just became like, why aren't we doing Slack? And so even though it's just the two of us, we create a Slack channel. Yep. And we created it with the assumption that over time we might have, we might bring like listeners of the show in to communicate with one another. So you'll see on the left, we have locked channels and unlocked channels. So the locked channels are just he and I. I do have an intern. Her name is JC. She's great. She's in some of these channels. But it's mostly just Eric and I. And so from the beginning, we were super intentional about collecting feedback. And when we got it, we would share it in our feedback channel. So I would just like say the name and a little bit about the person to see like why they, you know, if they seem to be core to our audience. And so Mike Albert, you know, him, Sherry, he sent us a message. He's a finance dude. And he was like, very, very, very good. Nothing like that out there. Remember me when you're famous, which is like just good validation. Not much that we can learn from. Now on the other side, Eric's girlfriend, Colleen, says, upfront is too long. Would love to head directly in an interview. Unclear who our audience is. Eric's voice sounds worse than Jay's. Eric uses right and like a lot as filters. Yeah. And so early on, this is like 2 weeks after we launched these feedback. And we saw a lot of things related to the intro where they said the intro is too long. And so we went from like a 15-minute intro to closer to like a 6 or 7 minute intro. And the way we cut that down is we basically cut out anything that wasn't just objective truths. So now we talk about like who's invested in them, what type of funding they've had to date, where they're based, when they were founded, anything we find in articles about their traction revenues. One thing that we would do in the early days was say like, I really want to know about this and I want to ask about this. This is something I'm curious about. We realized that was kind of duplicative to just asking that question in the interview. So we cut all that out.
I see a pod strategy channel in your Slack here that's up on screen. Do you mind? You don't have to show me. You can show me. But what goes there?
Pod strategy is
that they communicate on to organize a podcast. Pod strategy channel.
Pod strategy is talking about like organization and the types of guests we're bringing on, the type of content that we want. So if we like say, so here's something we're struggling with right now. That's struggling with talking through. We have this standard style of episode, this 90-minute 3-segment type of show that we release every Wednesday. We've released an episode every Wednesday since we launched without fail. We've been having these conversations on the side where people, our guests mostly, will say, you should talk to X, Y, and Z. And that may be a community builder. It may be a investor that they're working with. And so we have like these 30 to 60 minute calls with VCs and angels and community builders in these different cities. And we said, we should be recording these because they're awesome. And so we started recording those. And now we've started releasing them. Our last 2 episodes have been with investors. And we're going to keep doing that. But something we're talking through on our pod strategy channel is instead of breaking up our regular style interviews and having those interviews on Wednesday or having those episodes go out on Wednesday, what if we would just release that type of episode on Fridays, kind of ad hoc, and instead of replacing that type of episode, just doing more content.
So you're doing a weekly cadence, and now you're saying to yourself, well, maybe we could start doing smaller bits, and that maybe actually even solves the problem of the feedback you've been receiving, which is it's too long. Now you've got a shorter episode. So interesting. Right. So it's a possible solution there.
Right.
Okay. So I feel like we've covered how the show came together. I feel like we've dove into some of like the nitty gritty of the show. Obviously I'm going to be linking up the show itself and stuff like that with this episode, so people can actually go listen to it. If you're listening to No Agenda Show on your podcast app, fire up the search Upside, and you'll be able to find it. It doesn't start with an A, so it's farther down the list for whatever reason. Anything else that you feel like you've picked up about the podcasting space in general, about the podcasting industry? Let's talk like philosophy and potentially even change of philosophy. Maybe you went into the industry one way, you now feel a different way. And then we can talk about the future a little bit. But yeah, I'm curious, just like an overall philosophy for people starting out. How do you see this industry? How do you see the work?
There's an actual lizard crawling across the carpet across from me right now. It's kind of wild, literally wild. Really? Yes, definitely, definitely see some things in the podcast industry. So something that's important to talk about, I think, is production and editing. Many of the like mega popular shows, your Serials, your Planet Money, anything related to NPR or Gimlet, highly produced. They have full staffs of editors, storyboarders, producers, recording people, audio engineers, full staff. They do incredible jobs on their shows, and it shows through. Like you can hear, it sounds like the audio version of a television show. It sounds like a radio show. Then you can go all the way down to completely raw. I recorded this. Here's the raw audio. I uploaded it, and you hear, Slack notifications in the background and coughing and and ahs. Yeah. And then there's a bunch of stuff in between. We found that there was a huge difference in the quality and listenability of our show if we did some very basic editing. And that was removing ums and ahs, cutting out some dead space or any awkwardness. Everything just feels a lot tighter. And once you have heard the difference, you start to hear it in all other shows. Just about every show does this, every major show does this, save for like the Tim Ferriss show, because he just doesn't need to, and he's like, screw it.
Can you?
But when you listen
how you do that? Is there a website you use? Do you want to pull that up?
Yeah.
While you're here.
And you'll notice it when you listen to interviews, and you'll hear somebody end their question and the guest answers like almost immediately. That isn't real life. They've like taken out either a preamble or even just the dead space between that. No guest is ready for the perfect, amazing response like that,
It's funny, vlogging and like on YouTube, like that same evolution happened, and like I don't always even remember that when I'm watching like a YouTube vlog sometimes, but it's definitely cutting, jump cutting. And yeah, you're right. I think you don't think about it, but these conversations that you're hearing sometimes, it's not the exact conversation that went down. It's tightly edited. It helps you go through the flow. And I think what you're alluding to, or you've already maybe said, is that the increase in effectiveness or like listenability of that is like drastic for your listeners.
And we cut out close to 15 minutes per show once we started editing, and it wasn't actual content. It was just complete waste.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes a huge difference, and I recommend it. And if I were to invest into one thing in our show right now, it would be for a skilled editor who could listen through our show, take out 15 to 20 minutes of non-essential stuff, but that comes with a level of like taste and understanding, and that's going to come at a higher expense, obviously. So what we use right now, right now we use a couple things. I'll actually just share my whole screen so I can show it.
Cool.
I use Upwork for our audio engineer, and his name is Nathan. I kind of hate sharing his name because I don't want everyone to fill up his time and take him off our show, but he's been amazing and been worth every penny. He lives in Nebraska, which is also in our kind of wheelhouse, and we share all of our raw files with him. Let's see if I can, maybe I won't be able to share it. We have a Dropbox that we share with him, and it basically just says like Nathan files. Actually, I know what I can do. I can move this over here.
So every show, and then the first thing you do is you Dropbox the MP3 to Nathan, who is ready to pick up the file and edit it.
Yeah, so we go into here and we throw his episodes into, we have like a folder for every one of our shows. And inside each folder, you have a few things. Let's see. I'll go into one that's actually finished, old episodes. So in each of these, we'll have some number of files. And some of them have more than others. That's kind of a special one. This one we had, nope, not that one either. Some of them are clean, some of them are not. Okay, this is a clean one. So we had one file where Eric and I recorded our intro, and I exported that as a file. Then we had the interview file and the third section file. And I'll send Nathan some notes for every episode and say, okay, episode specific needs. This one's pretty clean. Sometimes I just let him walk through it because some things are pretty evident that you need to take off. Like if somebody coughs or if somebody sneezes, he'll know to take that out in real time, because he walks through and actually edits out all the ums and ahs, which he can only do in real time. Taking out dead air, he can use a program for, but actually working through all the filler words, he has to listen through in real time and delete them. Every episode, I'll say before the show, we have a pre-show clip, which is like a 30-minute or 30-second segment of something interesting from the interview just to get people psyched. So I'll say, here's our pre-show clip. Here's some stuff I want to take out specifically in the intro file. Here's some stuff I want to take out in the interview file. Here's some stuff I want to take out in the third section. And he just does it.
I need one of those people in my life.
Which is great.
And Upwork seems like a great place to find people for that. Let's see, there's the that needs to be cut out. You've shown us this is amazing. Thank you so much for being willing to share all the behind the scenes. I feel like I'm getting a really clear picture into what it actually looks like to produce a podcast. Definitely some tools here and stuff like that I will link up as well. Let's share some wins here. I don't know if you want to bring up either your site or some recent metrics and stuff like that. And maybe you can just share like, what's been really cool lately about the show or something you're excited about for what's next. And we can kind of end it there with just like a little bit of, chat about that.
One quick nerdy thing that I'll transition from into some wins. Something else has been an absolute lifesaver for us has been this production schedule. And so every episode, we know we haven't missed a week because we know the release date of every episode. We know which guest is going out that week. We have 3 segments, and we know if each segment is ready to publish. Let's go more current.
We're seeing right now a very well organized spreadsheet with lists of all the guests and dates and stuff like that.
Yeah. So this week we released this John Fine episode. It's all been published. Next week, the episode releasing is this episode with Wicked Sheets. And we see that the first 2 segments are in editing right now. They've been recorded. The third segment hasn't even been scheduled yet. We haven't recorded the third segment yet. So it's not ready to go. It's got some time to go. Actually, I know the guest for this now, which is great. Lindsay's going to be on this episode with Ross.
You've got like this asynchronous you've got this asynchronous sort of spreadsheet that you share with your team. People can update it depending on pieces are done. Everyone's shared into the Google Doc.
Yeah. And we have this pipeline of guests that we want to bring on and whether we've contacted them, where they're based, if they've been scheduled during that or not. Some of them have already been recorded.
Content here. We're seeing the real behind, we're seeing the guest list. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we have some episodes that we want to go into that are deep dives that are outside of the regular stuff, like term sheets and multiples or opportunity zones. So opportunity zones, we found a great company called Hypothesis Ventures that just launched their fund investing in opportunity zones. We reached out to their founder, Peter, on Twitter the day that they announced their fund. And he's like, yep, I would love to do that. And so he's scheduled. We're going to talk to him in a week. It's great.
I feel like if you show any guests that you're reaching out to your production schedule that we're looking at right now, if you're watching online, I'd say yes. I'd say, yeah. You guys look like you know what you're doing here.
And we've had, and something that you talked about earlier, David, is like the quality of guests leading to other guests. We've been super intentional about that. We wanted early on to show like a certain set of legitimacy. So we had guys like Webb Smith. He's like a huge titan in the e-commerce and retail space. We had Anthony Pompliano, who is a huge voice in the crypto space. And now we just released 2 episodes with 2 well-known VCs in the Midwest. So when people want to run an eye test and check heuristics on whether or not your show is legitimate, having an average of that type of person is great.
Totally. So
All right. You want to talk
Let's share some wins. Yeah, I want to see. I want to see. Yeah.
All right. So this is Transistor, which is where we host. Every time you add an episode, it's super simple. You just go in here and you upload the file. You name the episode. This is taking a little bit longer than expected. Name the episode. Specify the date that it's going to go out on. Upload the file. And that's really all you need to do. You can add like the metadata down here, and it already pulls the image for you. So this is as easy as uploading and hosting podcasts is. Super simple. Then it syndicates out automatically to iTunes and Spotify and Breaker and Stitcher, Overcast, Pocket Cast. So 6 months old. First episode went out the first week of May here. And so in the first month, we had just over 1,000 downloads, which is actually pretty good. Yeah. And then that grew over time. And we were really excited at the end of August because when this graph was zoomed in and it was 1,500 was the highest axis of the graph, you could already see that this growth was looking exponential here. And then this month, we've just kind of crushed it. Like absolutely crushed what we've done in a previous month.
For those listening, 1,000 to 7,000 downloads within the past few months per month. And what do you attribute the recent jump to?
PR. So I'll show you the past 60 days graph, which shows a day-by-day breakdown. You can see on this graph, these spikes are days that we released episodes, and analytics tools are still pretty gnarly. Like the subscriber number up here is pretty far behind. We have more than this now, but what it does, and I'll tell you this on this question mark, podcast subscriber counts are notoriously difficult to measure. We average out the first 24 hours of downloads for your last 3 episodes to calculate an estimated subscriber count. And so our last 2 episodes have been released since we got a story in Fortune. Fortune magazine put out a list through their blog term sheet of the best business podcasts in 2018.
How'd they find you?
And it's so from what I can tell, the writer for this article, Paulina, she tweeted and asked her followers what podcasts and blogs they follow, and she took kind of like the most frequent answers that she got.
Once again, Twitter huge for you.
So Twitter's been huge for us. So a guy that we don't really know tagged us and the podcast, and I think that's how we found ourselves on this list. But you know, you got the Tim Ferriss Show, 20-minute VC, Invest Like the Best, How I Built This, Pitch, Masters of Scale, and right here, Upside.
Once again, another good alignment for guests and stuff like that. You can share the article when you're reaching out to.
Yeah. And so when that published on the 11th of September. And so September 11th, we had as many downloads that day as we had had any day previously. Our most popular episode was with Anthony Pompliano as a guest in a blockchain startup in Cincinnati. And then the next day we published a new episode. And so you see that immediately our downloads jumped up to 335 here. And that was awesome. What happened was people saw the story, they clicked the link, they subscribed, and then when we release a new episode, it pushes the download automatically to subscribers. And so even the 2 days following that, we had as many downloads as we had typically had before. And then this week, we released another episode, and now it's at 406.
Right.
So at some point, you just kind of hit escape velocity, and I don't think we're there yet, but you can see, like, just from that one story here, we have really great momentum. This graph over here is fun. You're asking about different players. So 36% of our listeners are on Apple Podcasts. 19% are listening on the web through the web player. Then you have Breaker, Pocket Casts, Overcast, iTunes, which is essentially still Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Android device. And then 7% are just other. But Apple Podcasts is still just dominating this. I don't think this would even be as popular if this wasn't where I was sharing constantly. Every time we post an episode, I share the website directly.
So
and then they can show you like different countries that
Yeah,
you're in.
that's awesome, man. Well, congrats on the growth of the show. Congrats on that article. And also, it just seems like, yeah, you're really setting this foundation for how you're going to get guests that are more quality, which will keep, being this feedback loop. And I think the other thing is, too, you've clearly been thinking at each step, how do we sort of incrementally improve this, whether it's the sound or cutting sections out or cutting out ums or, yeah. So there's all these different things I think you're doing that they keep kind of increasing this quality. And I love seeing from the beginning, which is this, like, we have this idea, it seems interesting. What if we tried it as a podcast, to like really formalizing in a very step-by-step manner. And I think it just goes to show, the people who find it today, it didn't always start like that, but at the same time, it seems like you've been pretty relentless in how you've improved, especially on the operational side. So since this is no agenda and we're kind of coming to the tail end of the show here, I like to just kind of riff. Usually I'll like bring random links and stuff like that, but I actually just have a topic I want to cover and then I'll let you go. I know you've been gracious with your time here today. The topic I kind of want to chat about a little bit is actually monetization. So I just read monetization in the podcasting space. So my quick preface personally is that there's kind of two things I'm seeing. The first is that traditionally podcasting as an advertising space has been very valuable. There's two reasons for that. One, your audience is very engaged. So someone might be listening for an hour. Therefore, because their attention is so focused on this like asset, advertising is a very valuable place to place advertising. It's very natural, and the fans are dedicated. The second thing is the listeners tend to be very niche and specific to different industries. I mean, like you said, your listener is it's a very particular type of person. So once again, for advertisers, not only is it a great medium to place an ad, it's also very specific in who you're targeting. The flip side is the analytics have been terrible, it sounds like. Now, the second piece of information I want to bring to this just discussion on whatever your thoughts are on podcast monetization is I just saw an article that's been floating around the web. I need to read it a little bit more, but basic premise was that in China, the podcasting industry is massive. And the way that podcasts in China monetize is through subscriptions. And so people will spend, $3.99 or whatever to subscribe to their favorite podcast. So actually, many of the popular podcasts in China are not free. They're a small subscription, and there was already $1 billion, I think, a year in revenue for podcast subscription. Pair that to the US, which is advertising driven in how podcasts monetize. And I believe it was $300 million a year being spent on podcast ads. So that, I don't know, that's like an interesting, I guess, context maybe that I'll set some things that I'm seeing. But I'm curious if anything comes to mind about podcast monetization or the stuff I just brought up.
Yeah, a lot of stuff. So I think that things will definitely go towards subscription in the US. I don't know if it'll be an either or thing. I think there could still be subscriptions and ads. But one, people are definitely being more reticent to ads because it ends up taking like the first 6 minutes of the show and listeners get annoyed and skip through the first 6 minutes of the show. The second being anytime that you have sponsors, now you have certain censorship you feel on yourself, whether it's real or just your own perception. The problem is with subscription, it's not really going to be viable for many shows, and neither is advertising. So for us, there's our preferred podcasting player is Breaker. And Breaker is a startup themselves out of San Francisco. They went through Y Combinator, and they are this social podcasting app. So you see what your friends are listening to, what your friends are subscribed to, what they have liked, what they've commented on. It's easy to send podcasts to each other. There's better discovery in my mind. There's like a discover section. But Breaker reached out to us when they were launching their new monetization platform. And they just announced it 3 weeks ago. And they asked if we would be one of their partners going out with that. And we turned it down, not because we didn't want to do it. And we think that's probably a good long-term sustainable revenue model. But if you made all of your episodes by subscription only, you're going to stunt your listenership and growth from the beginning. And it's more valuable for us to show that our product is good and that people want it, and then monetize the audience once the audience actually exists, than to try to monetize in the beginning. So we're certainly not making money on our podcast right now. We've put thousands of dollars into production at this point to get it to where it is today. But I think that will be the way of the future. And it doesn't have to necessarily be subscribed to every episode. It could be like these coffee chats we talked about, these Friday episodes. It could be bonus content like that. And the great thing about apps that allow that, it's actually a pretty frictionless buying experience in the UI, because you could go to a show and click purchase for a certain episode or certain content and just scan your fingerprint, and it could come from like your Apple Pay. It's way more frictionless than other subscription services where you have to make an account, add a credit card. You can just do it from your phone. So I think things will go.
Yeah, it makes me think a little bit about, obviously we've got Patreon, which is kind of like a behind the scenes type. It's typically what people monetize is the behind the scenes on Patreon. It's kind of like exclusive content for subscribers. What's interesting about the China sort of case is, in China, people see it as very educational. These podcasts are teaching people new and valuable skills. And that's why there's less of a friction there for actually purchasing these podcasts, because they see it as like a key to their education, which is just sort of interesting here in the US. But I definitely agree. I mean, you have to have the audience to be able to flip that switch. And I think you're right in the like unique exclusive content is maybe what's most valuable, or community is valuable. Like you showed your Slack chat, maybe pulling people in there.
Yeah. And there's the merchandise side of things that's possible too.
Yeah. I mean, Dissect, which is a really popular music show, I feel like is potentially very well positioned to do some really interesting stuff. So Dissect is a music analysis show. They can do merchandise. They do merchandise. They do really interesting things where they have subscribers like submit stuff. So they can kind of do these like giveaways and like prizes. I actually have seen some podcasts live. I went to go see the last podcast on the left live. So live tours is another big monetization. That's a very great margin, right? Like if you're just in person on stage for an hour and 2,000 people show up, if you have that pull, it's it becomes very lucrative. So
I think Dissect, I mean, they're a Spotify original podcast now, which probably means they're getting some sort of sponsorship money from
that's right. You can also go the network route. If your show is popular, you get picked up, and they place the ads for you.
But again, like a lot of the stuff is very much concentrated in people who have like this large audience, right? But I would think that subscription is more sustainable and feasible for smaller niche shows than advertising, because it just doesn't, smaller niche shows may not have the reach, but they would have a very ravenous, supportive fan base.
And it's also just good career wise. I mean, I think it can also be leveraged into other things like Dissect. I find really interesting. I'm not sure if he's doing this yet, but my assumption is that he could be a musician's assistant. I mean, like I would, if I'm a musician, I'd hire that guy immediately, because he's so in tune with the nuances of this production. So consulting, or, and you spoke about that a little bit early on, is just, the other purposes for this podcast. But well, Jay, thank you so much for spending the time. It's been fascinating jumping in behind the scenes and really getting a sense of like the nuts and bolts of putting together a show. And like I said, it's just been really fun to see it blow up and grow the way it has. I feel like a year from now, we're going to like look back and your metrics are going to be even crazier, and it's going to seem like, oh yeah, that wasn't that big of a deal back then. And that's a good thing. So thank you for being willing to share and for hanging out on No Agenda podcast. Like I said, we've been sharing our screen the whole time, so you can see all the different things we've been talking about. I'll also be linking up many of the tools which Jay has listed out for how he puts together a show. But thank you again, man. Just appreciate you being gracious and spending the time.
Yeah, likewise, dude. Thanks for having me on. If you guys haven't watched David's interview with Matt Diabella yet, check out the Ground Up show. David did an awesome interview where he's on the other side of the microphones, and you'd probably enjoy it. And
go check out Upside on iTunes or all the places you can listen to podcasts. And you can hear that intro song with the Woo music. And
still gets me hype.
Yeah, and now you see where it all started. So thanks again, man, and we'll chat again soon. Later.